All right, so get ready because today we're diving into some seriously thought-provoking stuff about economic history. You know that story we always hear about how developed nations became economic powerhouses? The one about free trade and open markets being the only way to succeed?
Right, the one they often preach for developing countries to follow.
Yeah, exactly. But what if I told you that those same nations, they built their wealth on policies that might seem a little hypocritical today?
It's a fascinating paradox, and it's exactly what Ha-Joon Chang digs into in Kicking Away the Ladder.
Okay, so walk me through this. What's the main argument Chang is making?
He's saying that when you look at the actual history of industrial trade and technology policies, it's a very different picture than this good policies, good governance narrative we're often sold.
So instead of like a rising tide lifts all boats, it's more strategic.
Exactly. He uses this concept of infant industry protection, which is really central to his argument.
Okay, break that down for me. Infant industry protection, what does that even mean?
Imagine a country trying to develop a new industry, right? But they're up against these massive, established global players.
So it's like a newborn gazelle trying to outrun a lion.
Exactly. It's nearly impossible to compete without a little help. That's where infant industry protection comes in.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? How do you protect a fledgling industry?
Think tariffs to make foreign goods more expensive, subsidies to give domestic producers a leg up, things like that.
It's like giving them some training wheels for a bit.
Precisely. Give those industries some breathing room to develop and get strong enough to compete on the global stage.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. But how long do those training wheels stay on? At what point does an industry have to, sink or swim?
Now those are the million-dollar questions. And Chang dives deep into those nuances. How long should protection last? What are the criteria for an industry to be considered strong enough to go head-to-head with global competition?
Right, because there's obviously no one-size-fits-all answer, right?
Exactly. It all depends on the specific industry, the global landscape, a nation's goals. It's complicated.
This is already making me rethink some things. It's interesting because usually when we talk about protectionist policies, it's framed as a bad thing.
Right.
But Chang seems to be suggesting that today's economic powerhouses, the ones who preach free trade, they weren't always so opposed to a little strategic intervention themselves.
You got it. And he doesn't just suggest it, he meticulously documents it. He shows how countries we now consider bastions of free trade, like Great Britain and the United States, they weren't shy about using those very tactics themselves to nurture their own industries.
Okay, now you've got to give me an example. This is feeling like one of those you can't make this stuff up situations.
Oh, it absolutely is. Let's start with the United States, shall we? Land of the free, home of the brave, champions of capitalism, right?
Right, the poster child for free markets.
Would you believe they were once considered the most protectionist nation in the world?
Wait, seriously, the U.S. more protectionist than anyone? You're kidding.
Nope. Even more so than they are today. Chang digs up these incredible quotes from U.S. politicians and economists back in the 19th century, passionately defending their protectionist policies.
So it wasn't just like a behind closed doors kind of thing. They were openly protectionist.
Oh, yeah. They were loud and proud about it. They saw it as absolutely essential for building a strong, independent nation. They wanted to build their industrial base, and they weren't afraid to use tariffs and other measures to do it.
So they weren't messing around. This is blowing my mind a little bit.
And that's just the beginning. Let's hop across the pond to Great Britain. Their story is usually told as this early embrace of free trade, right? Which led to their economic dominance.
Right, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution and all that.
Exactly. But Chang points out that their love affair with free trade really only blossomed after they'd already built a massive head start.
Wait, so they were already ahead of the game, and then they decided to change the rules.
It's like they climbed to the top of the ladder and then kicked it away, making sure no one else could follow the same path.
Wow. And that's where the title Kicking Away the Ladder comes from, I'm
But
guessing.
you got it. And it wasn't just about protecting their own industries either. Chang shows how they actively tried to prevent their colonies, especially America, from developing their own manufacturing industries.
Oh, wow. So not only did they climb ahead, but they actively tried to hold others back.
Exactly. They wanted to maintain their dominance, even if it meant stifling the economic potential of their own colonies.
That adds a whole new layer to things. Talk about adding insult to injury, right?
Right. And these are just two examples. We haven't even gotten to France, Germany, Japan.
Oh, there's more.
Oh, yeah. Chang lays out equally fascinating cases from them, too. And what you see is this pattern. nations using these unfair tactics when they're the ones trying to catch up. But then, as soon as they climb the ladder, as soon as they become the dominant economic force, well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm ready for more curveballs. You mentioned France, Germany, Japan. How do their stories add to this whole historical rethinking?
Well, let's start with France. They've got that reputation for being very, interventionist.
Yeah, big government, lots of regulations.
Exactly. But get this. Chang points out that during a big chunk of the 19th century, France was actually surprisingly hands-off, especially compared to Britain. They were pretty laissez-faire.
Wait, hold on. Laissez-faire France. That just doesn't sound right.
I know, right? It goes against everything we think we know about them. But it just goes to show that these assumptions we have about countries, they don't always match up with their history.
So what happened? If France was so hands-off back then, did it lead to economic success?
Well, that's the thing. Chang's research indicates that this period of minimal government involvement actually coincided with a time of, well, relative stagnation for the French economy.
Wow, okay. So much for the idea that less government always equals a better economy. It sounds like finding that sweet spot is more complicated than just picking a side.
Exactly. Each country's path is different. Now, Germany's a really interesting counterpoint to France. They didn't go all in on tariffs like the US, but they were strategic. Chang highlights their investments in education and infrastructure as key drivers of their economic success.
So instead of just putting up walls to protect their industries, they focused on building a really solid foundation.
Exactly. They invested heavily in technical schools, universities, recognizing that a skilled workforce was essential for industrial development. They knew they needed people who could not only work the machines, but also invent new ones.
Yeah, it's like that saying, give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. But in this case, it's more like teach a nation to innovate.
Exactly. And it wasn't just education. They were strategic about infrastructure, too,
Yeah.
especially railroads. They understood that railroads were key to connecting different parts of the country, facilitating trade, getting goods where they needed to go. It was all very strategically planned.
That's a great point. This reminds us that industrial policy isn't just about protecting your industries from competition. It's about making smart investments in the future, investing in your people, and building a foundation for long-term growth. It makes you wonder if there are some valuable lessons here for developing nations today.
It's a question worth considering, for sure.
Hmm.
All right, we've talked about the U.S., Britain, France, and Germany. Ready for another curveball? Let's talk about Japan.
Oh, yeah, Japan. They're a fascinating case. I mean, they industrialized incredibly quickly in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. How does their story fit in with all of this?
Well, Japan is a perfect example of how there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to development. They actually face some serious constraints in using protectionist policies.
Constraints, what do you mean?
They were bound by these things called unequal treaties.
Unequal treaties? That doesn't sound good. What were those all about?
Basically, in the mid-19th century, Japan was pressured into signing a bunch of treaties with Western powers, mostly the US and Britain. These treaties severely limited Japan's ability to set their own tariffs, forcing them to open their markets to foreign goods.
So it was a way for those Western powers to maintain their economic dominance and prevent Japan from protecting its own industries.
You got it. It's a good reminder that economic history is often written by the winners, and the playing field is rarely level, even today.
So how did Japan manage to industrialize so rapidly if they couldn't protect their industries in the same way these other nations did?
That's where it gets really interesting. They had to get creative. Since they couldn't rely on tariffs like the U.S. did, they found other ways to achieve their goals.
Give me some specifics. What did they do?
One really fascinating strategy was setting up state-owned model factories. Think of it like a technology transfer program. The government would build these factories showcasing the latest and greatest technologies from around the world.
So it was like the government was taking on the role of the innovator, showing everyone what was possible.
Exactly. And here's the clever part. Once these technologies were proven and the model factory had served its purpose, the government would sell it off to private companies at really low prices.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like giving those companies a head start, a blueprint for success.
You got it. And this allowed Japan to adopt cutting-edge technologies really quickly, even without using those traditional high tariffs. It's a real testament to their resilience and adaptability.
It just goes to show there's no single right way to develop an economy. It's all about understanding your context, your challenges, and being willing to try new things, to experiment.
Exactly. And Japan's story highlights how important it is for governments to be willing to invest in their people and industries and be strategic about long-term growth. It takes vision.
Okay, this is all fascinating, but it's a lot to digest. Before we jump to what this all means for us today, can we take a minute to recap some key takeaways from these examples? What are the common threads running through the stories of all these different countries?
You're right, we've covered a lot of ground, and I think you've hit on a crucial point, which is the importance of understanding the historical context. It's easy to look back and judge based on what we know today. But to really understand how complex economic development is, we have to resist that urge. We have to remember that what might seem obvious now wasn't always so clear-cut back then.
It's about taking a step back and trying to see the world through their eyes, right?
Exactly. And when we do that, we see that each of these nations, despite their differences, they all recognized how vital a role government plays in shaping economic outcomes. Whether it was tariffs, subsidies, education, or infrastructure, they understood that leaving everything to the whims of the free market wasn't always the best approach.
Right, they were willing to use every tool in the toolbox. And those tools change over time, don't they?
That's exactly right. It's about choosing the best tool for the job at hand. And I think that's a crucial lesson for anyone who's interested in economic development, whether we're talking about historical analysis or tackling the challenges we face today.
Okay, so we spent a lot of time digging into these fascinating historical examples. We've seen how countries we now consider the architects of free trade weren't afraid to play by a different set of rules when it benefited them. But where do we go from here? What does this historical context mean for us today? Especially when we think about developing nations today. They're trying to navigate a global economy that often feels stacked against them.
Absolutely. And that's where Chang really brings it home. He argues that we need a much more nuanced view of protectionism, especially now, with the huge productivity gap between developed and developing countries.
So you're saying that what might look like a really high level of protectionism in a developing country, it could actually be completely justified.
Exactly. You have to look at the context.
Right.
Think about it like this. Imagine a local bakery trying to compete with like a massive multinational food corporation.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Right. They're both in the baking business, but the resources, the tech, the sheer scale of their operations, it's just not a level playing field.
Right, like apples and oranges.
And that same logic applies to developing nations trying to build new industries. They're being asked to compete with these seasoned veterans without the same advantages.
It's like asking them to run a marathon with a ball and chain strapped to their ankle. Not exactly a fair fight.
And to make it even tougher, Chang argues that a lot of the rules of the global economy, as they exist now, they actually reinforce those disadvantages.
Okay, so you're talking about institutions like the World Trade Organization.
Exactly. The WTO.
Because even though their mission is to promote free and fair trade, are you suggesting that their policies sometimes actually hinder the economic growth of developing nations?
That's what Chang argues. He's saying that some WTO agreements actually limit the ability of developing countries to use the very tools that developed nations use to get ahead. Things like technology transfer, flexible patent laws, even targeted protectionism.
It's like saying you can't use the ladder to get up here, but oh, and by the way, we're going to keep moving the platform higher.
Exactly. It creates a situation where catching up seems almost impossible.
It feels like the deck is stacked against them.
Right. And that's why it's so important to learn from history. It's not just about righting past wrongs, but it's about making sure we don't repeat those mistakes. It's about creating a fairer system for everyone moving forward.
So for our listeners out there, what's the one big takeaway you want them to leave with today? What should they be thinking about after they finish this deep dive?
If there's just one thing you take away, it's this. Question everything. Question the stories we tell about economic success, question the fairness of the global trade system, question whether there's really a one-size-fits-all solution to these complex challenges.
It's about looking beyond the simple answers.
Exactly. Economic history is messy. It's full of contradictions. And the more we question those contradictions, the closer we get to a better understanding.
And hopefully, a more just and equitable world. Well, folks, I think that just about wraps up our deep dive for today. We've covered a lot of ground, explored some hidden histories, and hopefully challenged some of your assumptions along the way. As always, thanks for joining us and keep those questions coming.